The city of Chicago did not care whether you slept or not. It moved the same way at 2 in the morning as it did at noon, loud and indifferent, and full of people who had somewhere to be. Amelia Martin understood this better than most because she was almost always somewhere she had to be. Whether it was the lecture hall on the north side of the university campus, the cramped apartment she shared with her mother on Ashford Street, or the polished dining floor of Hargrove's restaurant downtown, where she worked 4 nights a week and every Saturday. She'd been doing this since she was 18. 2 years of threading between tables in a black uniform, carrying plates that cost more than her weekly paycheck, smiling at people who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. She did not resent them exactly. She understood that when people sat inside a place like Hargrove's, they were buying an experience. And part of that experience was pretending the people who served them were invisible. She had made peace with that. What she had not made peace with was the exhaustion, the way her feet ached on the bus ride home, the way she fell asleep over her textbooks and woke up with ink on her cheek. But nursing school was the plan. It had always been the plan, since she was 12 years old and sat beside her grandmother, out in a hospital room in Indiana, and watched the nurses move through that place with a kind of purpose that seemed almost sacred to her. She wanted that. She was willing to carry plates and smile at strangers to get it. Her mother, Gloria, worked in a diner 3 blocks away. Gloria Martin was a woman built from patience and strong coffee. Her knees had been giving her trouble for 2 years, but she never mentioned it unless someone asked directly, and even then she kept her answer short. She and Amelia were close in the way that people become close when they have been through hard things together and chosen not to fall apart. They ate dinner together on Sunday evenings and talked about everything except money, which was the thing they both thought about most. It was a Thursday in October when Donovan Pierce walked into Hargrove's. Amelia noticed him the way everyone in the room noticed him, because he was the kind of man who made a room reorganize itself around his presence without even trying. He was tall, with dark hair cut close and eyes that moved across the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who was calculating everything he saw. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made specifically for his body, and he walked with the particular confidence of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. He was with 4 other men, all of them in suits, all of them carrying the same tight energy of people in the middle of a business deal that had followed them out of the office. They sat at table 7, which was Amelia's section. She went to them with the leather-bound menus and her standard greeting, warm and efficient, the kind she had rehearsed so many times it no longer felt rehearsed. 2 of the men smiled at her. One was on his phone. Donovan Pierce looked up from the menu and looked directly at her for a moment, not unkindly but not warmly either, just assessing. The way someone looks at a piece of furniture to decide if it will hold. She took their drink orders and went to the bar. The evening was moving quickly. 3 other tables were active in her section, and the kitchen was backed up, which meant timing. Everything was a kind of small choreography she had to manage on her own. She was carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water and a bourbon on ice back toward table 7 when it happened. One of the other servers, hurrying past from the opposite direction, clipped her elbow. It was a small collision, barely anything. But the bourbon shifted and jumped, and a portion of it landed on the sleeve of Donovan Pierce's suit jacket. The table went quiet. Amelia felt her face go hot. She set the other glasses down immediately and reached for the cloth at her apron. "I am so sorry," she said, and she meant it completely. "Please let me help with that." Donovan Pierce looked at his sleeve. Then he looked at her. The look was long and flat and entirely without warmth. "Do you understand?" he said, his voice even and low in a way that made it carry further than a raised voice would have. "What this jacket costs?" Amelia kept her hand extended with the cloth. "Sir, I apologize. It was an accident. Our manager will of course cover any cleaning costs. That is not the point." He pulled his sleeve away from her cloth without touching her hand. "The point is that a person doing this job should be capable of carrying a drink without emptying it onto a client. If you cannot manage that, perhaps this is not the right position for you." One of the other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Another looked at his menu. Amelia stood very still. She was aware that several people at surrounding tables had paused their conversations. She could feel the heat of their attention on the back of her neck. She breathed once, slowly, and kept her expression composed. "I understand your frustration," she said quietly. "I will send your manager over immediately." She turned and walked back toward the host station, with her shoulders straight and her face forward. She did not allow herself to react until she was behind the partial wall near the kitchen entrance. And even then, she only allowed herself 3 seconds of pressing her palm flat against the cool tile wall before she straightened up and went to find her manager. Her manager handled it with practiced smoothness. Apologies were made. A complimentary round was offered. Donovan Pierce accepted neither warmly nor coldly, and the dinner continued. Amelia served the rest of her tables. She brought their food. She refilled their glasses. She did not allow herself to look at table 7 unless she was directly attending to it. And when she cleared their dessert plates, she kept her voice and expression exactly as professional as they had been all evening. It was only when the restaurant thinned out around 9:30, when the last of the big tables had paid and gone, that Amelia allowed herself to sit for 15 minutes in the small, back hallway with a glass of water and her nursing textbook open in her lap. She was not really reading it. She was looking at the diagram of the human circulatory system without seeing any of it. She was not crushed. That surprised her a little. She had thought she would feel worse. What she felt instead was a dull, specific anger, not at him exactly, but at the ease of it, the way someone with enough money and a certain kind of face could make another person feel small in front of a room full of people and then simply continue eating his dinner. She thought about her mother's knees. She thought about her nursing school tuition bill, which was due in 6 weeks. She turned the page in her textbook. What she did not know, because she was not watching, was that Donovan Pierce did not leave immediately after dinner. He sent his associates on ahead, something about a document he needed to review. And he sat alone at the table with a glass of water and his phone turned face down, which was unusual for him. From where he sat, he had a partial view of the back hallway where Amelia was reading. He watched her for a moment, not in any calculating way, but with something that might have been curiosity, or something older than curiosity, something closer to recognition, the way a person sometimes looks at a stranger and sees, without understanding why, something that matters. She turned another page without looking up. Donovan Pierce picked up his phone, stood, buttoned his jacket over the dried bourbon stain, and walked out of Hargrove's restaurant without telling himself why he had stayed. But that night, in the back of his car on the way to his penthouse, he thought about the way she had stood in front of him with her shoulders straight and her face composed, and he could not entirely put the image away. 3 weeks passed before Donovan Pierce walked back into Hargrove's restaurant. Amelia was refilling a water glass at table 4 when she saw him come through the front door. He was alone this time, no associates trailing behind him, no energy of a business deal following him in from the street. He was wearing a dark navy jacket. He had his hands in his pockets, and he stood at the host station for a moment before the hostess. A young woman named Britt led him toward the dining floor. Amelia watched him from the corner of her eye and felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly. More like the specific alertness of a person who has been caught off guard by something they thought they had already dealt with. He was seated at table 9. Table 9 was in her section. She considered going to her manager and asking to swap sections with one of the other servers. She stood near the service station for about 4 seconds thinking about this, and then decided against it. She had done nothing wrong 3 weeks ago, and she had nothing to apologize for, and she was not going to rearrange her evening around a man who had made her feel small in front of a restaurant full of people. She picked up a menu and walked over. Donovan Pierce looked up when she arrived at the table. There was a brief pause, the kind that lasts less than a second, but carries a full conversation inside it. He recognized her. She could see that clearly. And she could see, just as clearly, that he had known she worked here when he sat down. "Good evening," she said, setting the menu in front of him with the same composed professionalism she brought to every table. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Still water, please." Of course, she turned to go, "Miss Martin." She stopped. He had read her name tag, or he had remembered it from the incident, which meant he had been paying more attention that evening than she had given him credit for. She turned back around. "I owe you an apology, Donovan," Pierce said. He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed, not insincerely but carefully, the way someone speaks when they are not accustomed to the words and want to get them right. "What I said to you 3 weeks ago was unnecessary. You handled an accident professionally and I responded poorly. That was not acceptable." Amelia looked at him. She had not expected this. She had prepared herself on the walkover for something cold or dismissive or simply the blank courtesy of a powerful man who barely registered the people around him. She had not prepared for an apology. "Thank you for saying that," she said. She kept her voice even and genuine. "I appreciate it." She brought his water and gave him time with the menu. When she came back to take his order, he ordered simply a grilled salmon and a side salad. Nothing like the elaborate multi-course meals the business dinners at Table 7 had run through. He was not here to impress anyone. That, more than the apology, made her curious in spite of herself. The restaurant was moderately busy, but not overwhelming, which meant Amelia had more breathing room between tables than she usually did on a Thursday. She brought his salmon when it was ready and asked if he needed anything else, and he said no, and she moved on. It was when she came back to check on him, midway through his meal, that he spoke again. "Are you studying something?" he asked. The question was direct but not rude. He had apparently noticed the corner of her textbook sticking out from the pocket of her apron, which she had shoved there during a quick break. Earlier and forgotten to put back, she pulled the book out slightly so he could see the cover. "Nursing," she said. "Third year." Something moved across his expression. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration. The look of someone updating a picture they had formed of another person. "At which university?" "Midwest State." "Over on the North Campus?" He nodded slowly. "And you work here how many nights a week?" She looked at him, not defensively, but with the quiet directness of someone deciding how much to share with a person who has not yet fully earned it. "For nights and Saturdays," she said. "My mother works nearby. We are managing." He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his eyes that she could not name. Not pity. Would have closed the conversation immediately if it were pity. But something more like attention. Real attention. The kind that is actually rare. "That is a heavy load," he said. "It is what it is," she replied, and it was not said bitterly. It was simply true. She excused herself to check on another table. Donovan sat with his salmon and thought about what she had said. He was not a man who thought much about other people's interior lives. He had built an entire existence around not doing so, around data and systems and outcomes. Things that could be measured and therefore controlled. People were variables, mostly. They behaved according to incentive structures and self-interest, and once you understood that, you could predict and manage nearly everything. He had not predicted Amelia Martin. He was still thinking about this when the front door of the restaurant opened, and Priscilla Vane walked in. Donovan saw her before she saw him, and his first instinct was the same instinct he had when he encountered any complication, which was to assess the situation quickly and determine the most efficient response. Priscilla was with 2 women he did not recognize, all 3 of them dressed for a dinner that was more social than sustaining. She was laughing at something one of the women had said, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes moving across the room with the practiced ease of someone who expected every room to welcome her. Her eyes landed on Donovan. She changed course immediately, excusing herself from her companions with a practiced gesture and making her way toward his table. "Donovan Pierce, eating alone on a Thursday," she said, sliding into the empty chair across from him without being invited. "I did not think you knew how to do anything alone." "Priscilla," he said. His tone was not unfriendly, but it was not warm either. She looked around the restaurant with the proprietary air of someone who considered herself a regular everywhere she went. Her gaze landed on Amelia, who was approaching the table with a small bread basket for the neighboring table. "Priscilla, watched Amelia move across the floor, and her expression shifted into something light and cutting. "I remember her," Priscilla said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Isn't she the one who spilled something on you last month? Your assistant told me about it. He said she just stood there with some cloth like she was going to wipe down a counter." Amelia had reached the neighboring table and was setting down the bread basket. She had heard. Donovan could see from the slight stillness in her shoulders that she had heard every word. She finished what she was doing without changing her expression and turned to check on another table. Donovan looked at Priscilla. He said nothing. This was the thing about Donovan Pierce that very few people understood correctly. His silence was not agreement. It was processing. He sat with Priscilla's comment for a moment, the way a person sits with a sound they have heard in the dark. Trying to identify it clearly, what he identified was this. Priscilla had just done, casually and for entertainment, the same thing he had done 3 weeks ago in anger. And watching it from the outside, he understood for the first time exactly what it had looked like. It looked small. It looked like the specific smallness of people who have never had to earn anything using only themselves. "I need to get back to my friends," Priscilla said, standing. "Call me this weekend. We have things to talk about." She drifted back toward her table. Donovan sat for a moment. Then he looked across the restaurant to where Amelia was standing near the service station, writing something on her order pad. She was not looking at him. Her expression was composed and professional and completely unreadable, and he recognized in that composure something he had trained himself to perform, and she seemed to simply have. He asked for the check when she came back. He paid it, and the tip he left was large enough that Amelia looked at it twice. Not with gratitude, he noticed, but with a particular kind of quiet pride. The look of someone deciding whether to accept something or hand it back. She accepted it. He thanked her and stood to go. "Miss Martin," he said, and she looked up. "I hope the nursing school is going well." "It is," she said. "Thank you." He left. That night, in his penthouse office on the 42nd floor, with the lights of Chicago spread out below him like a second city made of electricity, Donovan Pierce sat at his desk and did not open his laptop for a long time. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and thought about a woman carrying a nursing textbook in her apron pocket and working 4 nights a week and Saturdays and managing. He thought about the way Priscilla had spoken and the way Amelia had stood there and absorbed it without flinching. Not because it did not hurt, he was sure it did, but because she had decided somewhere along the way that she was not going to let the careless words of other people alter her course. He had spent years believing that the people who built walls were the strong ones. He was beginning to think he had that backward. The next morning, before his 7 o'clock call with the Singapore office, Donovan Pierce did something he had not done in longer than he could clearly remember. He wrote a letter. Not an email, a letter by hand. On the plain cream stationery he kept in the left drawer of his desk for occasions that had not previously arisen. It was not long. It was not eloquent. It said that he owed her more than a single apology, and that he was aware of that, and that he had no expectation of anything in return, but wanted to say it plainly. Regardless, he had it sent to Hargrove's restaurant, along with a small arrangement of white flowers, simple ones, nothing that could be read as grand or performative. Then he went into his 7 o'clock call and did not allow himself to think about whether she would respond. Amelia arrived at the restaurant that afternoon for her shift and found the flowers at the host station with her name on the envelope. Britt handed them over with wide eyes and several unasked questions. Amelia read the letter once at the host station, then folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went to start her shift. She did not respond, but she did not throw the letter away either. And that night, she got home and her mother was already asleep, and the apartment was quiet and small and familiar around her. She took the letter out and read it again at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Going cold beside her, she sat with it for a while. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her bedside table, which was where she kept the things that mattered. Her grandmother's photograph, a letter from her nursing school acceptance, the small notebook where she wrote down the things she wanted to remember. She was not sure yet what Donovan Pierce was. She was not sure whether the man who had humiliated her in front of a room full of people and the man who had written this careful, unpretentious letter were the same man or two very different versions of someone still figuring out who he was going to be. But she thought about what her mother always said, that you could tell more about a person by what they did after they got something wrong than by anything they did when things were easy. She turned off the light. Outside the window, Chicago moved through the night the way it always did, indifferent and alive, full of people deciding, in small and large ways, who they were going to become. Donovan Pierce showed up at Hargrove's restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon, which was the one day of the week Amelia worked the lunch shift instead of the evening. He walked in at 12:30, and this time there was no pretense about it. He asked Britt at the host station if Amelia Martin was working today, and Britt, who had been following this situation with considerable personal investment since the flower delivery, said yes, and led him to a table in her section, without even being asked. Amelia saw him from across the floor and felt the now familiar tightening in her chest. She finished taking the order at table 3, walked the slip to the kitchen window, and then crossed the floor to where he was sitting. He looked up at her, and there was none of the careful blankness he usually wore. He looked if she was reading him correctly, slightly uncertain, which on a man like Donovan, Pierce was so unusual that it almost changed the entire shape of his face. "You did not respond to my letter," he said. "No," she agreed. "I understand that." "I do." "You need a few minutes with the menu?" He almost smiled. It did not quite make it all the way to a smile, but it came close. "I am not here for lunch, Miss Martin. I was hoping you might have a few minutes to speak with me during your break." She looked at him for a moment. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin, and she had a 15-minute break coming in about half an hour. She was aware that every reasonable instinct she had been raised with was telling her to keep her distance from powerful men, who had already shown her who they were in a difficult moment. She was also aware that those same instincts had been formed by a version of the world that did not always leave room for the possibility of genuine change. And she had spent enough time in nursing school, studying human behavior, to know that people were more complicated than their worst moments. "Half an hour," she said. "I get 15 minutes. "That is enough," he said. "Thank you." She went back to her tables. When her break came, she poured herself a glass of water and sat down across from him at the now empty corner table near the window. The afternoon light came in at a low angle and made the whole front of the restaurant look softer than it usually did. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Donovan Pierce looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. He was a man who was very good at speaking in boardrooms, and very bad, she suspected, at speaking in any situation where the outcome could not be controlled in advance. "I want to explain something to you," he said. "Not as an excuse for how I behaved. There is no excuse for that. But because I think if you are going to make any sense of why I am sitting here, you deserve more than an apology." She nodded once. "All right." It was quiet for a moment, organizing something internally. "My mother died when I was 26, he said. She had been sick for 2 years before that. And during those 2 years, I was in New York building the first version of Pierce Capital, working 18-hour days, telling myself that the best thing I could do for her was make enough money to cover every medical cost and every specialist and every treatment available. I told myself that was love. I told myself that was the right way to handle it." He paused. "I was not there when she died. I was in a meeting in Manhattan. My brother Reed called me, and I stepped outside and stood on a sidewalk in November and could not feel anything. Not grief, not regret, nothing. I had been running on control and efficiency for so long that I had genuinely lost the ability to feel things in real time." Amelia sat very still. She had not expected this. She had expected something more guarded, more managed. This was not managed at all. After that, he continued. "I built the rest of the company, and I became very good at it, and I became someone who people did not challenge and did not question, and I told myself that was strength. When things went wrong around me, I was sharp about it because I had confused sharpness with competence." He met her eyes. "What I said to you that evening was not about you. It was the reflex of a man who had trained himself to cut before anything could cut him. That does not make it right, but it is the truth. Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, a bus moved slowly down the street, and a woman walked past pushing a stroller, and the ordinary machinery of the afternoon carried on the way it always did. My father left when I was 9, she said. She had not planned to say it. But something about the honesty he had just offered made the exchange feel like it required honesty in return. He was not a bad man exactly. He was just someone who could not hold the weight of a life that did not go the way he expected. My mother stayed. She has been staying ever since, working herself down to the bone, never complaining, never asking anyone for anything. And I watched her do that my whole life, and I thought, that is what strength looks like, just absorbing everything and continuing. She turned the water glass slowly in her hands. But I have also been thinking lately that absorbing everything in silence is not the same thing as being strong. Sometimes it is just being alone, and I am tired of being alone in things. Donovan Pierce looked at her with an expression she could not fully name. It was not pity, and it was not admiration exactly. It was closer to recognition, the way a person looks at something they have seen before, in a different form. Why nursing? He asked after a moment, and the question was genuine, not conversational filler. She felt something relax in her, some small defended place, because the nurses who took care of my grandmother were the only people in that hospital who treated her like she was still a whole person and not just a case to be managed. They remembered her name. They noticed when she was frightened. They sat with her when no one else could. She looked at him steadily. I want to do that. I want to be someone who actually sees the person in front of them. The words landed between them, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Donovan cleared his throat. There is something I want to offer you, he said, and I need you to hear it correctly before you respond. She waited. I would like to cover the remainder of your nursing school tuition. All of it, whatever is left, including your final year. No conditions, no expectations, no strings of any kind. It would be structured as an educational grant through my foundation, completely separate from anything personal between us, handled by my legal team so that it is clean and clear and you would owe me absolutely nothing. Amelia looked at him. A long silence stretched between them. She felt the pull of it immediately. The way a person feels the pull of something they need when it is placed directly in front of them. The tuition bill. The 6 weeks she had been pushing to the back of her mind, her mother's knees. All of it pressing quietly against her from the inside. And then she felt something else. The familiar resistance of a woman who had been careful her whole life about what she accepted from people and why. Because she had learned early that gifts from powerful people sometimes came with a cost that only appeared later. Written in small print in a place you had not thought to look? She asked. "'Cause I can," he said. "And because what I said to you in this restaurant was the kind of thing that can make a person doubt themselves at exactly the wrong moment. And I do not want to be someone who made your road harder." She shook her head slowly. "That is a generous answer, Mr. Pierce. But I have been managing my road for a long time without help from anyone. And I am not sure I want to change that by accepting something this large from a man I do not know." "That is fair," he said. And he did not push. She looked out the window. A moment passed. "I will tell you what I would accept," she said slowly, turning back to him. He waited. A conversation. More than one, probably. "I want to know who you actually are before I decide whether to accept anything from you. Not Donovan Pierce, the CEO. Not the man in the newspaper. The actual person." She met his eyes. "If after a few honest conversations I believe that this offer comes from a real place, and not from guilt or the habit of buying your way out of things you have done wrong, then I will consider it. On my terms through your foundation, exactly as you described, with a written agreement I can have reviewed independently." Something moved across Donovan's face. It was not quite the reaction of a man who had gotten what he wanted, because this was not what he had expected. And it was not the reaction of a man who had been refused, because she had not refused him. It was the reaction of a man who had been met as an equal, possibly for the first time in a very long time, and did not entirely know what to do with that. "Right," he said quietly. "I get off at 4 on Thursdays," she said, standing. "There is a coffee place 2 blocks east of here called Birchwood. It is small and not impressive, and they make very good tea. She picked up her water glass. If you want to have an honest conversation, that is where I will be next Thursday at 4:15. She walked back toward the kitchen without looking back. Donovan Pierce sat at the corner table for another few minutes, looking out at the street where the afternoon was doing its ordinary, unhurried work. He had walked into the restaurant that day with a plan. The kind of structured, outcome-oriented plan he applied to everything. And the plan had not survived the first 5 minutes of the actual conversation, and he found that he did not mind at all. He left Hargrove's and walked 2 blocks east, out of habit or something that had not yet decided what it was, and found Birchwood without trying. He looked through the window at the small interior, the mismatched chairs, the handwritten menu board, the kind of place that had no interest in impressing anyone. He went back to his office. On Thursday at 4 o'clock, he left the office early, which his assistant noted with visible surprise and no comment. He walked the 6 blocks to Birchwood in the October cold, with his hands in his pockets, and arrived at 12 minutes past 4, which was the closest he had come to being early to anything personal in years. Amelia was already there at a corner table by the window, still in her coat, a pot of tea in front of her and her nursing textbook open beside it out of habit more than intention. She looked up when he came in, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than anything she had shown him before. He ordered a coffee at the counter and sat down across from her. "You came," she said. "I came," he said. Outside the window, Chicago moved through the late afternoon the way it always did, loud and indifferent, and full of people with somewhere to be. Inside Birchwood, 2 people who had started in the worst possible way sat across from each other with warm drinks and the particular fragile openness of people deciding, carefully and without guarantees, to try being honest. It was not love yet. Neither of them would have called it that. Not on that Thursday afternoon in October with the steam rising from their cups and the city going on outside the glass. But it was the thing that comes before love, when love is built by people who have learned to be careful with themselves, which is that it was real and it was chosen. And it had begun not in a grand moment, but in the quiet decision of 2 people to sit down together and tell the truth. Amelia poured her tea. Donovan Pierce, for the first time in a very long time, had nowhere else he wanted to be. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to click like, share this story with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more meaningful stories.